Praise be to God, there is no other God except God. It has become quite trendy these days to debate hatefully about whether there are 3 or 5 contact prayers per day mentioned in the Quran. And both sides to this issue rely on 4 Quranic verses. Here they are. Verse 2458 mentions the dawn and the afternoon or evening prayer. Verse 238 mentions the middle prayer. And then verse 11114 mentions prayer times at two ends of the day and when night arrives. And then verse 1778 mentions a prayer time at the decline of the sun until the darkness of the night and the dawn prayer. Now, those who believe in 3 prayers say that only the first 2 verses here mention the official prayer times, and the last 2 verses just repeat or describe those same 3 prayers with different words. On the other hand, those who believe in 5 prayers say that yes, the first 2 verses mention 3 prayers, but the last 2 verses mention 2 additional prayers, which are not mentioned in the previous 2 verses, and thus making a total of 5 prayers. So which of these opinions is right? Well, the truth is that if we rely on these 4 verses alone, we, the submitters, should not reach a definite conclusion about it, because these verses alone do not give us sufficient information to make a definite conclusion. So then what is wrong here? What are they missing? In fact, they are missing a crucial verse in the Quran, which once you read it, it opens up a whole new understanding of many other verses, and only then can we reach a definite conclusion about the number of prayer times in the Quran. Here is the verse 98:5, which says that God did not make it obligatory except to worship God sincerely in the correct religion and to do the contact prayers and the zakat. And this is again reinforced in verses 9:11 and 9:5, where God tells us that if people do the contact prayer and the zakat, then they fulfill all the basics of religion and should be considered brothers in religion. I know that Hajj and Ramadan are also obligatory, but at specific times of the year, and someone might decide to join the religion at another time of the year, outside of the Hajj or Ramadan seasons. And this is one of the reasons why only the contact prayer and zakat are mentioned as the basics of joining the correct religion. And knowing that zakat is an annual ritual, then we can conclude that the contact prayers are the only obligatory daily ritual for the submitters. Now you might wonder, what does this have to do with times of contact prayers? Well, keep this in mind. Keep in mind that God is asking us as daily religious rituals to do only the contact prayers. But then, for example, in verse 50:39, God tells us to glorify and praise Him before sunrise and before sunset, which is a daily ritual, and it is given as an order, not optional. The verse is expressed as a clear obligation. So then, if it is a daily obligation to glorify and praise God before sunrise and before sunset, wouldn't this contradict the previous verse where God told us that He does not order us anything else as part of a daily ritual except the contact prayers? Yet in the other verse, He's also ordering us to glorify and praise Him before sunrise and before sunset. And this would be a logical contradiction, unless this obligatory glorification and the praise of God are part of the contact prayers. So this unlocks a whole new understanding. Now we understand that all the obligatory daily rituals which are mentioned in the Quran, including the prostration, the bowing, the glorification of God, the praising of God, and so on, they all must be part of the contact prayers. And this means that when God is telling us to do those obligatory daily rituals at a specific time of the day, He is saying to do it at that specific time of the day as part of the contact prayer, which means that it is also telling us that at that specific time there must be a contact prayer. So now we have more verses from which we can draw the conclusion about the number of contact prayers, because this means that we have to expand our search to all the verses which order us to do obligatory daily rituals. In fact, now we do not only have 4 verses, but we have a total of 19 verses which mention the contact prayer times in the Quran. So here are all those verses. Let's go over them one by one. But before we do that, let's put them in a daily timetable. To understand it easier for now, let's imagine that you live in the equator, where the day and the night are always 12 hours during each day of the year. This will enable us to use clock times in this table, which is easier to understand for most people. So according to the Quran, the night comes before the day, so the calendar day starts when the night starts. In this case, in the equator, it would be when the clock is 1930. So let's present the hours here starting from 1930, which is the edge of this table. Then we have 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, which is midnight. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 o'clock, which is exactly when the sun rises in this example. And then we have 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, which is exactly midday in this example. And then we have 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. And then that tiny edge beyond 19 is half an hour, which makes it 1930. So here we represented all the 24 hours of the day as they would be in the equator. And we are doing this so that we can map the verses presented here using clock times, without having to adjust for day lengths and so on. So anyway, let's now put all the times of the contact prayers, which are mentioned in the Quran, in this timetable. I will try to give you the literal translation from the Arabic. And every time a prayer time is mentioned with a different wording, I will present it with a different color, so that you can know that it's a different expression there. So the first verse here is verse 2564. In this verse, God orders us to do the contact prayer at the darkness of the night. Then in the following 4 verses, verse 73:2, 73:20, 39:9, and 50:40, God orders us to do the contact prayer during the night. And then again in verse 52:49, God orders us to do the contact prayer during the night and at the fading of the stars, which in the equator happens from around 4:30 until 6 a.m. By the way, some boxes here are too small to fit all the text, but you get the point. The colored box, not the text, represents the length of that time. Let's continue. Verse 11, 114. In this verse, God orders us to do the contact prayers at night and at the 2 edges of the daylight. So the beginning of daylight and the end of the daylight. Then in verse 20, 130, God tells us to do the contact prayer at night and before sunrise, which is also the beginning of daylight, and before sunset, and at the end of daylight. So here now we have in the same verse 4 contact prayer times mentioned, which by the way means that from this verse alone we can conclude that there must be at least 4 prayer times, because these are all present as different prayer times within the same verse. But let's complete this analysis first before we reach definite conclusions. In verse 50:39, God tells us to do contact prayers before sunrise and before sunset. In verse 30:17, God tells us to do the contact prayers when we reach the morning and when we reach the eve. In the following 3 verses, verse 33:42, 48:9, and 76:25, God orders us to do the contact prayers morning and evening. In verse 24:36, God tells us to do contact prayers during the early day and evening. And the expression early day here more literally means breakfast. But in the past, the time of breakfast varied from day to day and from region to region, changing from dawn until lunch. And in some regions today, they even actually understand it as lunch when they use that word. But anyway, here the word used in the Arabic, if we look at how that root word is used in other verses in the Quran, then we can realize that it is talking about the time period from early dawn until lunch. Next verse. In verse 1778, God tells us to do a contact prayer at dawn and at the decline of the sun until the darkness of the night. In verse 24:58, God tells us to do a contact prayer at dawn and at Isha. And to define Isha, we can look at other verses of the Quran where the root word is used, and we can see that it refers to the afternoon period plus the evening period. It includes both times, just like in English, for example, the word brunch includes both breakfast and lunch. Similarly, we do not have an English word for Isha, so I'm translating it here as afternoon/evening. And by the way, traditionally they used the word Isha to refer to the night prayer actually, but that is because the prayers do not have official names in the Quran, and they did not have clocks in the past. So people named the prayers themselves actually according to the time which had just passed, instead of the time in which they were at that moment. Like for example, they said sunset prayer, traditionally, but the sun had already set. By sunset prayer, they meant the prayer after sunset, which is the evening prayer. Or they said noon prayer, but what they meant by that is the prayer after the time when the noon happens. So don't let the names confuse you. Even though traditionally they use the word Isha prayer to mean the night prayer, what they meant is that when the time of Isha fully passes, and the time of Isha according to the Quran is afternoon or evening, then we do the prayer, which actually happens at night. Next verse. In verse 30:18, God tells us to do a contact prayer when noon happens and also during Isha time, which is afternoon and or evening. In verse 40:55, God tells us to do a contact prayer in the morning and also during afternoon and or evening. And then finally, in this last verse, God tells us to do the middle prayer, and the word middle has many meanings here. One meaning is the middle of the day, which is noon. So let's present it here with this green color. And another true meaning is that it's talking about the sun being midway between the highest possible point in the sky, or 90 degrees, and the lowest possible point in the sky, or 0 degrees. And the middle of those two is 45 degrees elevation. So after the sun passes below 45 degrees in elevation, which would be the afternoon prayer, and let's represent it here with this brownish color. And once we reach the conclusion that there are 5 contact prayers, then the other meaning is also that the middle prayer is the noon prayer, because it comes after the night and the dawn prayer, and before the afternoon and the evening prayer. As you remember, the calendar days started with the night, and then the day follows. So this would make the night prayer the first prayer, and then that would make the noon prayer the middle prayer, or the third prayer. Another meaning of the middle prayer, which is also true, is that it's the afternoon prayer, if we count the prayers from the moment when we wake up, making the dawn prayer the first prayer, and the afternoon prayer the middle prayer. So these are all the contact prayer times mentioned in the Quran. They are mentioned in exactly 19 verses, mentioned with different wordings or different expressions, and each different expression is represented with a different color in this timetable. And to be proper submitters, we should fulfill all these 19 verses fully, all these colors. But what is the minimum number of daily contact prayers in this equatorial day example, which would ensure that we fulfill all these 19 verses? We already showed that it cannot be just 3, because that would go against verse 20, 130, which mentions 4 different contact prayer times. And also, it would go against verse 11, 114, which mentions the night prayer and the evening or sunset prayer as 2 different prayers, which goes against their distorted belief that the night prayer and the evening or sunset prayer are the same prayer. And also verses 17 and 18 in Surah 30 go against their distorted belief that the afternoon prayer and the noon prayer are the same prayer always, because these verses clearly mention the afternoon and the noon prayer as 2 different prayers. But anyway, how many daily contact prayers should there be in this example? Well, as you can see here in this timetable, we might actually be able to fulfill many verses here with the same contact prayer. For example, if we do a contact prayer at dawn, we fulfill the expression to do it at dawn, but we also fulfill the expression which says to do it before sunrise. So then, given that we can kill many birds with one stone, given that we can fulfill many of these 19 obligations simultaneously, what would be the most efficient way to fulfill all these 19 verses of the Quran? What would be the minimum number of prayers which we have to do in this example so that we fulfill all the verses of the Quran? So to answer this question, let's draw vertical arrows and try to touch all the colors here with as few arrows as possible. So let's put an arrow here, and we fulfill all those dark blue obligations. Then let's put another arrow here, and we fulfill all these obligations. We could also put it more to the right, but then we would have to put 2 arrows. We are trying to hit as many colors as possible with the same arrow. So if we put it here, more to the left, those late morning colors are also hit, because all of them start at early morning anyway. Now let's put another arrow here. Many colors here. Now if we move this arrow to the left to try to hit these brownish colors as well, then we would be missing these pinkish colors to the right. This means that we are going to have to add another arrow so that we can hit both the brownish and pinkish colors. So let's add another arrow. And if we move this arrow to the left to hit the green colors as well, then we would be missing the brownish ones. So this means that we have to add yet another arrow to cover these green ones. And now we have finally covered all the colors. And guess how many arrows we have? We have 5 arrows. These 5 arrows are the 5 daily contact prayers. So the 5 daily contact prayers are simply the most efficient way to fulfill all these 19 verses, all these Quranic obligations, all these colors. If you try to do it with less than 5 prayers in this equatorial day example, you would be going against at least one of these verses. And if you did it with more than 5, with 6 for example, why would you do that? Why do 6 prayers when you can achieve the same results with 5 prayers? As the saying goes, work smarter, not harder. So again, the 5 daily contact prayers in these equatorial examples are simply the smartest, or the most efficient, or the best, or the easiest way to fulfill all these 19 verses of the Quran, which prescribe daily rituals at specific times of the day. So the conclusion is that according to the Quran, for this example, the most efficient way to fulfill all the daily contact prayers is to do 5 daily contact prayers. These 5 daily contact prayers don't have official names, but for easier communication, let's label them here as the night prayer, the dawn prayer, the noon prayer, the afternoon prayer, and the sunset prayer. And as you can see from this timetable, there is some wiggle room or margin of freedom when you can do these 5 prayers, as long as you hit all those same colors with that same arrow. So you can do the night contact prayer anytime when there is full darkness in the sky, which happens when the sun is more than 18 degrees below horizon. Then from the moment when the sun reaches 18 degrees below horizon until sunrise, you can do the dawn prayer. And then from the moment when the sun reaches the maximum elevation until the sun declines at 45 degrees above horizon, you can do the noon prayer. And then after that, the afternoon prayer until sunset, after which the sunset prayer can be done until the sun reaches 18 degrees below horizon. If you want to know why 18 degrees, watch my other Friday sermon titled Twilight, Evening and Dawn. So these are the 5 contact prayers at the equator, which is what happens in Mecca as well, and what happens in most of the world during most of the year. There are rare cases, however, in specific locations within specific times of the year where you can fulfill these 19 verses or all these Quranic obligations with less than 5 prayers. And in those cases you should do so. Again, work smarter, not harder. For example, if the day is too short, let's say in Sweden in winter, then these brownish colors here move to the left, and when they move all the way to the left where these green colors are also, then they practically come in the same place as the green colors, which means that we can then hit all these browns and greens with one single arrow instead of 2. Basically, we would need only 1 prayer there, and that would count both as the noon and the afternoon prayer at the same time. Or for example, if the day is so long that the night doesn't happen at all, like in Norway during summer for example, then these blue colors are completely absent. And in that case, we do not need this arrow to hit these blue colors. They don't exist. And in that case, we just don't do the night contact prayer. There is no night. I'm not stopping you from doing it, but it simply doesn't exist in that case. You cannot apply something which doesn't exist. So anyway, the point which I'm trying to make is that in general, there are 5 contact prayers per day through which we fulfill these 19 verses, but in rare cases, in rare locations during a portion of the year, we can fulfill those 19 verses with 4 prayers, or even in more rare cases with 3 prayers, and then in extremely rare cases with 2 prayers, and in the most extreme cases at the North and South Poles with only 1 prayer. And I give all these cases and the exact circumstances and the exact times and locations where they happen in the video clarification titled Times of Contact Prayers. And on top of that, there are other exceptions when you're allowed to just pray without doing the actual movements of your body, which the Quran allows more and more in our modern busy world. And you can learn more about those exact conditions or exceptions in my other Friday sermon titled Lessening and Shortening the Contact Prayers in Civilized Spaces.